is a disclaimer that I want to give everyone. I'm just the guy that does a little bit of stuff with alternative assessment. So my disclaimer is this. I am in no way saying that my version of what I'm doing is correct or the best practice, or there are no real best practices. So what I'm saying is I would like to preface my discussion today about ungrading with the words, for me. For me, this works. This is what I try to do. This is what my students and I try to do. So again, please don't think that I'm saying that one approach is better than the other, or that one practice is more effective than the other. The other thing is ungrading is a large umbrella. Many, many approaches to ungrading are under that umbrella, which is beautiful. So I'm going to show you some of the approaches that I've taken in my years of teaching. I'm starting my 23rd year of full-time teaching at the community college level. So, and I'm continuously learning, failing, iterating, fixing, tweaking, and all of that. So again, even today, I was looking at my definition of ungrading, and I was tweaking this even today. What I would give you is the too long didn't read version of this presentation is basically ungrading is a pedagogical philosophy or mindset that tries to decenter the control-based function of grades to create space for learning that's divorced from stress. So in ungrading, the approach is that the learning process takes precedent, where we center students in a position to display agency, chart their learning growth, take risks, and really tap into that internal locus of assessment that they have. So basically, if I could sum it up in one phrase, it would be process over product. And we know that when we focus on the product in grades, students tend to focus on the product and game whatever system they're within, with good reason, to try to get to that product and get to the grade that they want to get to. And so a lot of times that hides the learning process. And so for me, assessment can illuminate learning, but it can also bury it under arbitrary standards that really encourage mimicry or copying rather than authentic expression of some cognitive self that our students are. And so that's my nutshell of ungrading. So this semester, I gave one of my sections a quick little survey with this question: what words immediately come to mind when you hear the phrase, "this will be graded"? And I put it in a word cloud, and you notice the word that pops out right in the middle, and that's stress, along with some other nice, funny things like hell nah, bro. So there's a lot of reactions when students hear the words, "this will be graded," or "for a grade." But notice in the middle there is the stress, the anxiety, the immediate panic that some folks have written in here about this relationship between learning and grades. I gave the very same students this survey, and I asked them, rate on a scale of about 1 to 4, whether you agree or strongly disagree with these statements. And if you notice, many of them don't enjoy writing experiences in school, but 3.3 out of the 5, they actually have writing confidence, which is a weird dynamic, that disconnect there between enjoyment and confidence. So where are they getting that confidence? That's what I would like to know. And then I'd like to take risks in my learning and don't mind failing at times. And notice where we tend to disagree with that. So students come to our classes having maybe curbed their risk-taking, their freedom of choice and trying new things because they're fearing the failure that's usually embodied by a traditional grade. So what's wrong with traditional grades? What's the issue that I have? Well, for me, it's 3 things. One, they are transactional and inequitable. So we focus on the ranking, the norming, the uniformity of trying to get the students in my class to do some objective that I've found or given to me to produce in the class. And so we sometimes focus on efficiency. And if you notice in your grade book, in any LMS you use, We have lines and columns and rows where students are put in, and so grading can be quick and efficient. In fact, the LMS that I use, Canvas, has a thing called Speed Grader. If there's not a more accurate way of showing that grading should be for efficiency, is in the word Speed Grader. And so when grades are inequitable, they're based on sentiments of scarcity. There's only so many A's, so many B's, so many C's in the class. Competition. Instead of viewing my peer as a collaborator, I view that person as someone who's going to try to get that A that I'm shooting for. And then, of course, meritocracy, that we know that meritocracy produces inequities all across the board. Grades are also stressful and anxiety-inducing. And I showed you some of that from my students, right? And so when we are stressed to earn that grade, it does tend to create a bottom line zero-sum game where I've got to do what I got to do to get the grade that I want. And sometimes cheating is a side effect of that. And especially my area, my discipline, which is plagiarism in their written forms, I've never met a student who plagiarized simply because they set out to plagiarize. It was usually after a stressful, panic-driven night where they had to get a deadline met with an essay, and so they went ahead and copied and pasted. Finally, grades are arbitrary and inaccurate. I've been in many norming sessions in composition faculty meetings, and it's very, very wildly inconsistent the way that professors view what is an A, what is a B, what is a C. And it varies between disciplines hugely. With humanities, our STEM area, there is really no consensus, and grades would be great markers of learning if we all could reach a consensus of what an A means, what a B means, what a C means. And of course, they're poor markers of learning in the sense that they are control-based. They produce compliance. Follow these rules, and this is the reward that you get. And then we have this problem of rewards and punishments instead of joy and inclusivity and compassion when we're learning. So Alfie Kohn is a great person to look into if you're interested in ungrading. And he talks about the 3 side effects of grades, which are students tend to think less deeply, they avoid taking risks, and they lose interest in the learning itself. Jesse Stommel's another great resource, and he talks about this idea of the language of grading focuses more on efficiency rather than the needs of an individual learner. And then we go back to that word of defensibility of fairness. What about fairness, being fair? Well, according to Rick Wormley, one of an author in assessment, he says fair is not equal. Fair is not equal. And so we defend equality and objectivity in the way that we grade, rather than focus on the equity that every individual learner gets what they need in our course. But yet we shroud objectivity in a theater-like environment. It's the objectivity theater, that I am objective because I have all these rubrics, I have all of these objectives, and I grade each paper according to the, well, we know that human behavior is certainly more subjective than objective. And so I found myself grading student essays out of my seat of privilege, of advantage as a white male teacher. And so I have to question and interrogate that objectivity all the time if I think that I actually have it, okay? So a lot of the question is this: if I don't grade it, will students do it? And this is a great question because motivation lies at the heart of learning. If you're not motivated to do something, very rarely you're going to learn deeply. And so we ask ourselves, well, what about intrinsic motivation? And intrinsic motivation starts very young, right? We look at the young children who are being introduced to school. They have curiosity, there's joy, there's excitement. And if you look at the studies, the degree of engagement and motivation drops every year a student is in traditional schooling. And so it starts quite early and goes all the way up to where we are in colleges and universities. So most of my grading used to be based on this assumption that I have to motivate students. So I'm going to motivate them through the fear of an approaching deadline. And that is, if you don't do it, you're going to lose 5 points off. And that's how I'm going to motivate you. And in a way, intrinsic motivation does work for a time, but it's very, very unsustainable. It does not last in a student. It's better to tap that intrinsic motivation of students. In fact, studies have shown that grades thwart. They actually cut off the psychological needs of students and their motivation. What works better? Narrative evaluations and actional feedback. Narrative evaluations, instead of a letter or a number, we're now talking to the student. And in this regard, we promote trust between us and our students, but as well as student to student as well, and that cooperation, because we're not competitive any longer. We're focused on the learning, not the assessment. And the assessment is important. Don't get me wrong, the assessment is important, but how we approach that assessment, again, pedagogy drives assessment. If we don't have a pedagogy of care, inclusivity, of nurturing, our assessments are going to reflect that. And I was guilty of this, and I wish I could go back and apologize to all those students that somehow I thought that I was motivating them through these harsh grading, punishing evaluation, and the like, and the attending harms that occurred. We also find out that feedback is most effective when it's not applied or associated with a grade. So we take away a grade, that feedback is way more impactful to students, and research bears that out. So what are some approaches that I've tried to do with ungrading? So I'm going to go over these in brief detail. Metacognitive practice, where we are thinking about learning and encouraging our students to do that. Encouraging our students to self-assess, that's one approach. Mastery-based learning or competency-based learning, or if you're doing specifications grading, where there's a standard or a degree of mastery that everyone is shooting for, that's also an approach. There's labor-based grading contracts. That's an approach that I've used before. And I'm finally this is the end of where I'm at right now. It's a model that I've created called a Labor-Reflex, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So metacognitive practice or assessment is this idea that assessment is formative at its core. We focus on the process of the learner and what the learner is going through before we get to that summative, have you ever heard of this phrase? Formative assessment is the chef in the kitchen making the soup. Summative assessment is when the patrons of the restaurant are tasting the soup. And so we want to focus on that process of how do we get the soup made, right? Self-assessment is, for me, based on the strengths of the student, not a deficit focus or an error identification. It's basically what works best for you in this context. Why do you feel the nature of your work is good here? And what can we do to kind of replicate whatever went into doing that? And of course, metacognitive practice and self-assessment is based on feedback and trust. There has to be a trust between the professor and the student, as well as student to student, okay? The other approach that I've used is mastery-based. And I call this, I don't like to use mastery-based learning. I like to say mastering. It's a present participle. It's actually ongoing. There's no destination. I love this quote here. Mastery is in the reaching, not the arriving. It's in trying to close the gap between where you are now and where you want to be. And so in that regard, the learning target is the fixed thing. The time is the variable. So many of my classes, the time was the fixed. If all 22 or 25 students didn't get that objective done by this due date, that's a problem. I have to take points off. Instead, mastering is this idea that learning is in progress. It's a process, and that's a process that we should celebrate. It's also asking students to provide the evidence that they feel most comfortable with. What are the evidences of your learning, rather than here's an assessment that I've created even before I knew you or met you or understood your needs. I created this way back when, and now I'm going to apply it to you, as if I'm going to uniformly push you into this mold of this assessment. Also, with mastery-based learning, really got into this idea of student conferencing and feedback. Again, hard to scale up. If I have a class of 200, I get that. But if there is some way to have a student reflect on their reaching the target, reflect on their learning and progress, that's good information for me to help me approach that student. If you think of the Latin word where assessment comes from, the Latin word where assessment comes from means to sit beside or sit alongside, conferring with the learner. I love that idea of coming up beside the learner in that dynamic of a relationship rather than a power dynamic of a hierarchy. It's a flat line relationship. That is what one thing that pushed me off of using mastery-based learning is that I would simplify my mastery behavioral, what I would call those end games, which is exceeding mastery, meets mastery, nearing mastery, below mastery. And what I found were students were just using those designators, 1, 2, 3, 4, for pseudo grades. Well, how do I get to the 4? Well, wait a second. I want to focus on your learning. Yeah, but how do I get to the 4? And so again, that was something that I learned that I had to be equitable in the way that I approach mastery-based learning. This is a great quote about mastery, which is the process drives the goal to mastery, not the marks, not the grades, not the points. So when I focus my feedback on how to help students grow and improve, that is way better than saying, here are so many points off that you didn't do to get that end goal of whatever grade you wanted. Again, it changes the conversation into a narrative conversation, into a communicative conversation, rather than a top-down conversation where I'm saying this is what you get and there's no other opportunity to come back or respond. Labor-based grading contracts are very interesting in that they already place the grade based on what the labor is required for that grade. The person that uses this approach quite well is Asao Inoue, Dr. Asao Inoue from, I think, Arizona State University. And he talks about this idea of labor-based grading contracts and using them for equitable, inclusive learning environments, where we focus on the labor of the student, honor that labor in all of its mystery and complexity. So for me, if I say, please do this by Tuesday, the student who has the time to devote to that, who has the advantage, the privilege of devoting to that, will probably do well in the environment. But when we change the ecology of grades to labor, now we're actually leveling the playing field that we are going to focus on the labor instead of all of the privilege that a typical assignment due date deadline would incur. So when we do labor-based grading contracts, we value that intentional cognitive production, the thinking, the planning, the ruminating, the creating that was put into that whatever cognitive product that deliverable that student created. And so for me, I use labor journals and labor support groups here, so that we were all in this together. Asao also uses a charter for compassion that I've adopted, where we talk about here's how we're going to labor together in our class. We're going to be fellow laborers, using compassion to help one another get to whatever we want to get to, whatever that learning target is. Now, the knock on labor-based grading contract is that it can be transactional. Well, for me, I tried to make the contracts agile. So if a student chose, I want to do this much work for this A, and life happens or something occurred in their lives where they can't meet the requirements of that contract, they could go ahead and change the contract. And of course, I'd be there to support them. So this is also a way of removing the grade and focusing more on the process, which would be the labor, because all learning is labor. All right, it just doesn't happen. It does take labor for our students. If we can honor that, maybe that's a good thing. Okay. I love this quote from Laura Gibbs. She talks about if we can focus, get the teacher out of the grading loop, give it all to the student, or at least invite them into the process, we can focus on encouragement and feedback rather than the grading. And I love this, and I'll get to this in a little bit. As a writing instructor, when I used to focus on grades, boy, the semester could be quite stressful, even for me and my labor load as well. This is where I am now. It's a labor-reflex model. I want them to labor, and I want to default labor in my class, but I also want them to reflexively and mindfully focus on their process. So I try to merge a little bit of everything: mastery-based learning, labor contracts, metacognition. And so I try my best, and I'm always tweaking, is to focus on trust, agency, reflection, positive attention, equity, and community. And so we invite the students into a compassionate learning environment where we are all invested for each other, not just to get a grade at the end. And so I have a default labor, but I also have opportunities for students to remain agile within that labor that they want to complete. I use best by due dates. I don't have hard deadlines. The best by means, just like anything, this is best done by this date if you can. If you are unable and you're not able, then okay. We will treat this as a soft target that we can then go ahead and figure things out. There's a ton of reflection in my class. Now, I've learned that not all of my students are open to reflection, have the skills or readiness to reflect. So there's been a lot of tweaking in my approach, which is to help students teach them metacognitive practice. And what does that mean? I found that it's easy really to focus on three things of our reflection. What's the scope of your labor? The amount, what did you do? The intensity, meaning, were you able to spend some intense moments of this, or was life happening and you couldn't devote a lot of intensity? And then, of course, what's the meaning that you derived from the labor? So those three things, breaking down reflection, have helped me. And of course, I end the course with a final self-assessment where the students use the evidence of their learning to determine that final grade. And so people say to me, wait a second, everyone will just give themselves an A. That's not usually what happens in my classes. Actually, I have to help students see the strengths and the growth that they've projected in the semester, because they immediately or reflexively downgrade themselves. I don't want to get cocky. I don't want to be overconfident and say that I earned this A. And so for me, it's a wonderful conversation based on all the reflection that we've done, all of the evidence that they've produced. And then we sit down and say, what would you choose as a final grade that would reflect? So when I say ungrading, I hope it's not a bait and switch for you. I still have to grade. I'm contractually obligated to assign a grade at the end of the semester. It's just ungrading helps me get there from a different route than all of the averages of all these assignments. And we could talk forever about the attending harms of averaging. But the idea is we're going to get there, but I'm going to invite my students in to do that. Now, I remember what Maha said, even in those attempts to give agency and freedom to students, we can unwittingly reaffirm oppression. And so my goal is not to unwittingly create more harm when I'm trying to avoid harm. And so I'm very careful about asking students, what is it that you can tell me, or what conversation we can have to arrive at that final grade? And the goal of all of this is that students will reflexively labor with mindfulness. Instead of doing something to punch the clock or punch the ticket to be done, I want them to really focus on their growth and the joy of having their labor recognized. And I love positive recognition. For me, positive recognition incites that parasympathetic nervous system, right? It's the well and dwell rather than the fight or flight. And the sympathetic nervous system is that whole grades, fight and flight, fight and flight. And I'm trying to reduce that anxiety and stress to have a good, comfortable, compassionate discussion about their learning. Of course, I'm going to cherry pick some of my students' comments, but some of my students have talked about this in their reflections, and I love this. It's been nice not to be caught up in the numbers or experience the strong disappointment of getting a bad grade. Again, the internalization of traditional grades in the students' minds, where they identify themselves based on this crazy system, where I'm just a C student. I'll never be an A student. Another comment was, I do not miss grades. I don't miss seeking approval of my work and performance anxiety. Imagine having what a typical college student might take 4 or 5 classes. Imagine having 5 opportunities for you to experience performance anxiety. Wow. And so we wonder why our students are overwhelmed emotionally, physically, and so mentally. And so this idea of, if we can somehow produce equitable learning environments that we can embrace their learning process rather than the products that they have to perform, boy, the better for us, right? Now, what happens when my students go to their other professors who might use traditional grades with traditional deadlines and penalties and all that? Well, I love this idea of transfer. And so one student once said, I think I'm going to try to use this philosophy in other classes because the grades will follow if you focus on learning the material. Now, in one of my links there for the virtual version of this presentation, I do have a link here to more other student reflections. And to me, if anyone asks me, does ungrading work? I always say, yeah, because I ask my students every semester. Ask the students, they will tell you. And for me, it's been what? Now, I still have challenges, obviously, and we can talk about those. But for me, this was a gnawing area of my soul that something was wrong here using traditional grades. There's got to be a better way to do no harm for my students. Now, would you like to dip your toes in the ungrading waters? Well, listen, we can still use traditional grades and still use some of the philosophy or mindset of ungrading. First off, number one, we can incorporate more self-assessments after assignments. I think Maha mentioned this, where if you give an exam, after the exam, ask the students, was this exam reflective of what you learned in my course? Did my questions come off as being fair? Did they give you every opportunity to show and exhibit your learning? So there are opportunities that we can still do this. 2, we can compose learning targets together with our students. A lot of us use the single point rubric, which is the one learning intention, and then ask the students, what were you working on and what did you achieve, or what can we celebrate for you to focus on this one learning intention. 3, using minimal grades instead of rubrics or arbitrary point-based assignments. I used to use rubrics that had, performance objectives across the line with all of these details. It was complex. Even for me, I can't imagine what my students thought when they saw a rubric. So can we minimize that a little bit? Can we just talk about what is acceptable, what's not acceptable? Can we focus on what is going above and beyond and what's meeting the mastery or meeting the objective? Again, minimizing the performance objectives. 4, we can emphasize formative practice, right, over the summative. Don't focus on everybody tasting the soup. Let's focus on what's the experience of you taking those ingredients to make the soup. Are you having fun doing that? Where do you have the most joy? Is it in cutting up the carrots or dicing the tomato? Whatever. It's in that idea of learning is a process, and a process of trying, getting feedback, iterating, doing it again in this process. Remember, the learning is the fixed thing. The time is the variable. And then 5, you can employ ungrading for just a small unit or a module in your class, or even just for some low-stake assignments. This doesn't have to be the rip off the Band-Aid where we blow up our courses. We can maybe use 1 or 2 activities where we say to the students, we're not going to grade on this. We're going to actually let you self-assess. We're going to actually invite you to self-assess. This slide from Jesse Stommel is wonderful. I go to this all the time. Small things you can do tomorrow if you want to start ungrading. Change the way we talk about assessment. Instead of deadlines, use invitations. Invite the students to converse about their grades, right? Grade less stuff, less often. Grade more simply. Maybe talk about what students are experimenting with or discovering in our course. And then if we can't do anything else, look at number 4. Just ask your students to reflect on their learning. What barriers do they face? And what are the challenges, or what are the achievements that they have? And then, of course, trust them. This is a little bit of my ungrading philosophy. I try to put the student at the center of the assessment process. Remember that internal locus of assessment that I want them to develop. I ask them to gauge their learning, trust them to know the information. Trust is a huge part of ungrading. They have unlimited redos and resubmissions. I don't use grades. I just use feedback to center on positive attention. Again, in English, in composition, very easy to do error identification. Redline an essay or a blog post. Instead, I'm responding to them as a human being with a pulse. And believe me, it's transformational. I've learned this. When I just talk to them about what they're actually writing, it's just wonderful about just my impression of thinking about how their brain works, trying to meet them on the page, meet their brain, their cognitive production, rather than, is this essay quality, or does it meet my rigorous standards? All of that. And finally, students can learn without grades. We all can learn, but we can't learn without feedback. And that's where that kind of focuses my intentions in using alternative assessment, is that I want to be equitable with my feedback. Every student needs feedback. Every student deserves feedback, whether it's from me, their peers, or themselves. Finally, there's no magic key to this. There's no right way to ungrade. There's no wrong way to ungrade. We're doing the best we can. As long as our intentions are done in good faith, remember our pedagogy drives our assessment. If our pedagogy is aligned with care, nurturing, compassion, our assessments should reflect that. And there is no magic key. I'm still failing, and then thinking, learning from places like this, meeting with you all about what your processes are, and then iterating and constantly changing. Finally, one major opportunity and advantage and benefit is that at the end of the semester, I'm kind of cool and collected. I used to be quite harried with a mountain of essays to grade at the end. Now, the reflection's been done throughout the year. The year now is a joyful celebration rather than the doldrums of trying to get through stacks of papers or exams or quizzes. This is in my virtual link that I gave you to this presentation. These are all links for some resources. I would say that I do have an all things ungrading website that kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to do with ungrading. Right smack dab in the middle of the screen down at the bottom, there's a Discord server that we have going called the Ungrading Hub. If you want to get in there and interact with other ungraders or other faculty who are trying their best to decenter grading in their courses, that's a great place to have. I think we have almost 500 members of that Discord server. So my name is David. I have my email there, and I'm on Twitter still, just like Maha. I haven't abandoned it yet. I can be found at dbuck.edu. If you want to tweet at me or email me, I'd be happy to share my thoughts with you or learn from you, actually. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to leave it now to, if we want to have some discussion or questions about this. Again, I haven't been looking at the chat. So Eliana, if you want to.
Yes, there's one question in the chat, but I will let Derek go ahead. He has.
Oh, yes. Hi, Derek.
Yes.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much. And thanks so much, David, for the presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. And thanks for this event. This has been such a fantastic event. I've learned so much all day. Kind of a two-part question, if that's okay. I'll try to be quick. I've been playing around with various types of ungrading in my classes now for a year with kind of mixed results. So I found in a graduate seminar where I basically went full ungrading and had learning conferences and gave only feedback and no grades, and students self-assessed and provided their grades. It went incredibly well, and it was like a utopian teaching experience like I've never had before. This term I'm teaching a 75 student undergraduate class, and have kind of revised it so that it's like a contract-based, kind of labor-based thing, and it's not going quite as well. And I think part of it is just the size of the class. I feel like I run up against this thing where it's like, I simply can't do the things I pedagogically want to do in a large class because I can't offer unlimited revise and resubmits. I can't do one-on-one student conferences. So part one is I'm wondering if you've had success with structuring ungrading approaches in large classes. And the other part is I find students are more resistant than I imagined because it's new to them and they're unfamiliar with, contract grading. And I find then the obsession on grades just becomes refocused on, well, how do I contract an A+? How do I contract? And the focus goes on there and I'm like, you're missing the point. You know what I mean? So anyway, any thoughts or comments on either of those, I'd really appreciate it. And thanks again for the fun. Great questions.
Number one, I would apply a heavy dose of grace and patience, because what I found, Derek, is that taking ungrading and plopping it right into a class without properly introducing it and getting students to think, you're just ripping an anchor away from them that they've depended on their entire academic careers. So now they feel adrift. And when you feel adrift, you start to panic a little bit. And so you start to grasp for what you are familiar with. And that's what they're probably doing. They're grasping at the familiar and missing like you said, the whole point. As far as scaling up, one of my resources on that last screen that I just showed you was Jesse Stammel's FAQ about ungrading. He has a frequently asked question about scaling up. And what he suggests is turning some of the responsibility over to the student, like maybe ask them for their own learning narrative or learning logs, instead of you having to collect and respond and collect and respond. The other thing is to provide feedback on a more global basis, which is instead of individuals, say, here are the trends that I see in this course. Here are some of the things that we can focus on. Again, I'm with you on that. My classes cap out at about 22 to 23 students. And even that I struggle to provide, so again, there's this idea of possibly, maybe it works for you, Derek, I'm not sure, but pushing the onus back onto the student to offer up what their metacognitive process has been like. Do you have to give feedback on everything? This is what I've been trying to learn my entire career, which is I have this egotistical, narcissistic view that if I don't set eyes on it, it didn't happen and the student didn't learn it. How egotistical can I be? So now I've said to the students, I don't have to feedback everything. I don't have to assess everything. I'm going to trust you to let me know your process. So again, that Jesse Stammel says, trust scales up. You can scale up trust, which is pretty good. I hope that answers some of your questions or gave you some thing to work with, but it's definitely a difficult one. Yeah. Oh, Alan. Yes. Good, Alan. Alan is one of my previous students, so I know Alan. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. David, you're still great. Always good. I've always enjoyed listening to you talk.
I'll give you the money after the event. I'll give you the payoff.
I'm a older student, so I'm kind of looking at it reflectively into the past. 68, and I still take the community college classes. My question to you, David, is since I've seen 2 semesters worth of your students, my writing ability has improved with your approach. I noticed that a lot of students, especially in community college, and you have a lot of high school students that are using these classes to get extra credit, especially to look on transcripts in colleges, is how they're managing their time management. I think that is a key. And also, David and I have talked about it and how maybe you can address it to the rest of us. The world doesn't operate in the way that your ideal is, okay? And when they come out of your class and they go back into the real world and the expectations that our work environments expect for production and consumption and for making money and whatever the other aspects are, how do you address that? The time management, and also get ready for the way the world is.
Yeah. So number one, you hit the nail on the head with the time management, because invariably every semester I have students who will miss the Best Buy dates, and then try to finish the entire semester in the last week of the class. And we know that that doesn't work. When we're rushed, we don't think deeply, we don't reflect, we don't have time for it. So this is one thing that I've been learning, which is reaching out quickly as well as consistently to students who seem to be struggling with the labor. And it's not, you missed so many assignments, please speak with me. It's, how are you doing? What's going on? Is there something that I can help you with? That little bit of high touch contact communication that I'm trying to do does make the difference for some of them. I'm not gonna BS you, Alan. It doesn't happen all the time. There are students that will still rush to do everything, but I've got to be gracious and compassionate to those students. And here's what I focus on. Is there some intensity of labor that they can produce that will adequately reflect their learning in the course? Instead of me saying, well, you didn't hit this word count, or you didn't hit this many assignments, who am I to say you have to reach all 50 of my learning activities, or 40, or whatever the arbitrary number is, you haven't learned in my course. So I've got to get out of that mindset as well. The second point is really interesting because Alan and I always go back and forth on this. And I really believe that the real world, or the working world outside of academia, is very similar to this idea of mastery-based learning. For instance, I can fail the bar exam multiple times and still pass it and become a lawyer. In fact, I can even fail my licensing for a pilot's exam and still pass it and fly an airplane. My driver's license. There are many instances in the real world where multiple attempts can be done for full credit. Who am I to say, if you don't take this one exam or essay, you're done, you failed? It's very, very interesting with that. I always tell Alan, when I was teaching my kids how to ride their bikes, I did not say to my daughter when she fell off the bike, put the bike in the garage, we're done for the day. I didn't do that. I went, oh, get back on the bike. Here's some tips on how to not kill yourself on the bike. Try it again. And so, yeah, but you're right. There are going to be contexts, just like I showed you on that screen, where students transfer. They're going to come into situations where hard deadlines are non-negotiable, where if you don't produce, you don't get the job. And my goal, hopefully, is that they will have that labor reflex growth mindset already there that says, let me focus on doing what I can do while maintaining my health, mental health, physical health balance, and still be productive. Because Alan and I always talk about this idea that we're unleashing students into this capitalistic world where it's all about, producing and consuming. And if you're not a good worker, you're done. And we want to fight against that a bit. And hopefully Ungrading will at least put that seed in the student's mind that they're more than their production. They're more than what other people say that they value. They have to really think intrinsically in that regard. So, Eliana, I think I'm pushing against 4:23. Do we have time for?
I have 4 questions, but
I would like to give them everyone a break, but I'll answer if you want me to.
Okay, so why don't we say that? Are they able to reach out to you if they have questions?
Yes, please. As I showed in my last screen, I'll put it back up just so you have it. There's my contact info. If you want to contact me, please feel free with any questions. I'll get back to you.
Yes, he will. I can attest to that.
And thank you for the opportunity, Eliana, and thank you all for attending this event. What a wonderful thing to do, and by the way, our students are the beneficiaries, which is always the driving force.